Many, many years ago, before kids, rescue animals, a mortgage, and a husband, I was a travel writer in Europe. I did most of my trips alone. This story is from the first time I visited Prague. I had never been to Prague, and the trip was last minute, so I had little time to prepare. My travel partner had dumped me in another country, and I was determined to make the best out of the trip by visiting a place I'd never been. Upon arrival at the train station, I visited the accommodation office and asked for a hostel not far from the center. In my early 20s, winging it was part of the fun. These days, I'm far less adventurous. The hostel they sent me to was a sprawling, crumbling, slate-gray Art Deco building on a nondescript street about a 10-minute walk to Stare Mesto. The inside was probably beautiful at one time, but by the time I checked in, it was full of shabby, mismatched furniture and cheap stained carpet. Most of the light fixtures were broken, leaving everything but the lobby dark and gloomy. It smelled of standing water and dust. I found my room, a double for $12 per night, and made note of the fact that I had a roommate. She wasn't there, but on her side of the room there was a suitcase, dressed neatly folded across the back of a plastic chair, a scattering of makeup containers on the beat-up desk, and a stack of German fashion magazines on the bed. I had no plans or goals on this impromptu trip, so I spent the afternoon exploring Old Town Square, the Jewish Quarter, and Wenceslas Square. I purchased some Czech crystals for my mom and painted eggs from a street vendor for myself. I also made reservations for a sunset dinner cruise for one. At around 6 p.m., I returned to my room to shower, change clothes, and unload my purchases. When I left my room about an hour later, there was no indication that my roommate had returned at any point during the day. After the cruise, I stopped at a tiny bar on Tinska and had a glass of wine. I'd heard horror stories about the dangers of Prague, but I felt no more trepidation than I did in any other large city. Sure, the cobblestone streets, fog rolling off the Vlata, backlit Gothic architecture, and winding alleys made me think of Jack the Ripper and Dracula, but in a good way. It was nearly midnight when I returned to my hostel, so I was surprised to find that my roommate still hadn't returned. That wasn't uncommon though. Backpackers are a fickle lot. She could have gone on a short overnight trip and just left her stuff behind, hooked up with a guy or girl, and was holed up at their place, or hanging out at another hostel, so I was surprised, but not concerned. I took another shower before bed, however, and was surprised to find that things in the room had changed up in my return. Her bed was neatly turned down, the magazines had moved to the nightstand, and the dress was gone. The strangest thing, though, was the addition of a pink silky nightgown spread across the bed. My bed. Maybe she thought she still had the room to herself. I didn't see how. My shopping bags, clothes, and toiletries were in plain view. I gently moved the nightgown over to her bed and then settled in for the night, as I wrote in my journal. I assumed that she was in the shower or somewhere nearby, so I expected her return shortly. After about an hour, though, her side was still empty. I needed to use the restroom before I went to sleep, so I made one last trip down the hall. The building was unusually quiet. There weren't the regular sounds of chatty backpackers, the clinking glasses, or music that would normally leak through the walls. There was nothing. It was hushed, like a church after the congregation has left. I found myself practically tiptoeing back. My room was near the end of the hall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the corridor was darker than before. The few working lights were blinking as they struggled to stay lit, and it reminded me of a funhouse. A tightness began to fill my stomach, and I subconsciously quickened my steps. There wasn't a soul behind me yet. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone gaining momentum on me. The only sound was the soft thud of my flip-flops as they struck my soles. I was flooded with relief as I flung open my door, but that didn't last long. Everything was exactly as I left it. except for the silky nightgown, which was now back on my bed. Sleep came in fits and starts. I left the lamp on for a while, still convinced my roommate would be right back, but the shadows it cast made the room even spookier. It was too dark with the lights off. I finally slipped into a deep sleep when I suddenly heard the door open. A man stood in the darkened doorway, the hall light behind him showing just enough for me to see his contorted face.
"I didn't mean to,"
he sobbed.
"You have to help me."
Too confused and disoriented to be scared, I sat up, scrubbed at my eyes, and reached for the lamp switch. But once the room was light, I saw that the door was closed. There was no man. I quickly bounded off the bed and went for the door. It was locked. Nobody could have entered without a key, and the hallway, empty. I passed the rest of the night fully clothed, sitting up in bed and with the light on. Though I'd paid for 2 more nights, at 7 a.m. I gathered all my stuff and went down to the reception desk to check out. "By the way," I said to the 20-something receptionist, "my roommate never returned. I'm a little concerned." She picked up the room key, looked at it hard, frowned, and then glanced at her computer. "What room were you in again?" When I repeated it to her, she looked back at her screen. "Ma'am, that room's been empty for 3 weeks, and it's been cleaned since then. We only have 6 people in the whole building." The hostel has since been renovated and is now a luxury hotel. I realized that we didn't physically meet, but I thought it relevant since I seemed to have met someone. Someone entered and left my room. I want to start by saying that this isn't the first bad experience I've had dog sitting, but it's definitely the worst. So I started dog sitting back when I was 13 and made good money doing it. I'm currently 19, and this happened when I was 18. I set up an easy way for people to contact me about dog sitting. I put out a post on Facebook and Instagram about it often and would get people in my messages asking me to dog sit. I got a notification from Instagram one day stating that someone was trying to message me. I accepted it, and the message said that me and my wife are looking to find a dog sitter while we go away for a week to Florida. You will have to work the 4th to 11th this month. We will pay you $300 for the week. You're welcome to stay at our house or go back to your own home. I started talking back and forth with this man, and we're going to call him Mr. Brown for the sake of privacy. So I agreed to take the gig and told him that I would stay at his house for the week. Once I got to his house, I was introduced to his 2 dogs, Mina and Letty. Mina was a little Yorkie, and Letty was a blue hound. I was shown around his house, which was surrounded by 76 acres. I live in a farm town, and I live on 32 acres myself, so staying here didn't really freak me out. The closest neighbors were pretty far away, and you would actually have to drive there if you wanted to talk to them. They told me the rules and when to feed them, blah, blah, blah. Then Mrs. Brown told me about the nearest neighbor. In her words, she was a nice person, just a little drugged up and confused. She mentioned how sometimes she would pull into their driveway instead of hers, and would end up mistaking Mrs. Brown for her dead daughter. Hearing this made me feel pretty bad for her, and I knew all too well how hard it is for parents to lose their child because of how my parents were after losing my brother in a car accident. Mrs. Brown said that she shouldn't do anything bad though, and if she came up to the house, just point her back home, and she would leave with no problems. After they left, I was down to watch movies and just chill with the dogs. The first 2 days were fine with no hiccups. The 3rd day, however, the old woman, who I'll call Miss Rose, did pull into the driveway. I came outside as she was getting out of the car. She looked up to see me, and immediately she got back in her car and left. I chalked it up to her realizing that it was the wrong house when she saw me and went back inside. Later that night, I got a call from Mrs. Brown asking if I was okay. I said yes and asked why. She then went on to tell me about how she got a call from Miss Rose and that she said that there was a robber at their house. I explained what happened and she just laughed and said that she must have been confused and forgot that they were out of town. I ended the phone call making a note to go over there tomorrow to clear the air about me being a robber. Once I went to bed that night, though, things got crazy. I woke up around 2, hearing a light scratching sound that almost sounded like ticking coming from outside the window. At first I thought it might have been a bird or some sort of night creature and left it alone. But the noise kept me from falling back asleep and I wanted to scare it away. So I got up and went to open the blinds, but screamed when I lifted the blinds at the sight of Mrs. Rose trying to pry the window open with a pair of pliers. Once she saw me, she started banging on the window with the pliers. The dogs started barking now, and I quickly got up, told the dogs to follow me, grabbed my phone, and ran to a room with no windows, which was the bathroom, locking the door just in case she got in. I called 911 and explained the situation, quickly giving them an address from what I could remember. She said that the police would be there in 10 minutes, which for the area I was in is pretty good considering their house is in a pretty rural area. I had gotten the dogs to be quiet and put them in the closet connected to the bathroom to make sure she didn't hear them. I was trying to stay calm, and I could still hear the pounding on the window as I continued to talk to the operator, and then I heard glass shatter. I cursed under my breath, trying not to cry. I was really scared and pretty much ready to cry from the fear of being beaten to death by someone who is clearly not in the right state of mind. I was whispering what was happening to the operator, hiding in the back of the bathroom in the tub. After about 4 minutes of pretty much silence, I heard footsteps and I could see feet under the other side of the door, and I cursed to myself again. I then see Miss Rose get on her hands, looking under the crack, and I mistakenly let out a gasp. She gets up, quickly pounding at the door, and I can tell she's still using the pliers. I am at this point crying, asking the operator where the police are, to which she responds, 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes felt like forever. I screamed at Miss Rose to please go away, and she screamed back that I shouldn't be here. Once I heard the sound of police cars, and about a minute later, them trying to kick in the door, I felt a little better. I was told to stay on the line until the intruder was caught, and that the police were trying to get into the house. Eventually, they did get into the house, and I yelled to get their attention. Not that they needed it, she was still banging on the door. Once they got into the room, she was told to drop her weapon, and she obeyed, saying that she didn't do anything wrong. They got her in cuffs, and a police officer told me that it was okay to unlock the door, to which I slowly got up and unlocked the door. After being taken to the police station and giving them my story for the report, I went to my parents' house. I was just too scared to be alone. The next day, I called Mrs. Brown and explained the situation. I got full payment even after telling them I wasn't going back to the house. They called me a few days later, saying that Miss Rose was under the influence of drugs, and in her words, she told the police that she decided to take care of the robber, me, herself, and that she did nothing wrong. She was charged with breaking and entering, which is kind of ironic. After that, I quit dog sitting, and I'm a lot more paranoid and always make sure my doors and windows are locked. So, Miss Rose, let's not meet again. This happened years ago in the 80s when I was 19. I live in a small town in the south, and it was common to have bonfires in the woods on the weekends in the fall. My friend and I, both female, went to a spot where a few others were hanging out in an open area of the woods. There was a fire, and we were all standing around drinking wine coolers and beer, just talking and hanging out. The main subject being a friend of ours who went missing a few days earlier. He was the kind of guy everyone knew, but I wasn't close friends with him. My friend is talking to someone, and a guy comes over to me and starts making small talk. He seemed a little weird, and I only knew him as the guy who dated a girl I went to grade school with. I couldn't quite understand why, but I felt a chill and an eerie feeling while he was talking. So much so that I walked away in the middle of this conversation and grabbed my friend and told her that we needed to leave now. She seemed a bit confused, but could tell by my tone that something was wrong. When we got to the car, I told her I couldn't explain it, but I just felt really uneasy, so we left and didn't think much else of it. A couple of days later, the guy's body was found in a shallow grave in the woods, and it was soon discovered that he was murdered over a dispute about a girl by none other than the weird guy making small talk with me at the fire. I still get creeped out thinking about how casually he was just out in the woods, hanging out, knowing that he had murdered a guy, and then everyone was discussing the missing friend in front of him. A twist to the story was just a few years later, he escaped prison and was on the run for about a week. I worked at a movie store at the time, and one day a woman came in to rent a VCR and movies. She was on some kind of drugs, and very obviously high. She was all over the place, and her eyes were wide, and she was talking nonstop. She proceeded to tell me that she was staying at a cabin at the lake with B, the escaped murderer. I acted normal and began filling out the info for her to rent, and I told her I had to get something from the back. I called the law and told them what she said, and they ended up following her and catching the guy again. Lots of creepy encounters growing up in the 80s. I loved growing up then, but definitely had a lot of close calls and weird encounters when I was younger.